Alrighty then, it's about 6:05, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the meeting. Hi, I'm Christian. I'm the historian. Uh, Today I'm giving a little lecture on the differences between indie game development and AAA game development. So to begin with, I'd like to start with some definitions as to what exactly I'm talking about. So when I'm referring to AAA games and AAA game development, I am talking about games that are made or otherwise supported by major publishers like EA, who make the FIFA games and the Sims games, Ubisoft, known for Assassin's Creed and Just Dance, and Nintendo, known for being Nintendo. Meanwhile, when I talk about indie games, I'm talking about games that are made by solo developers or are otherwise made without the support of these big publishers. Examples of indie developers and indie studios, Supergiant Games, who made Hades, Team Cherry, made Hollow Knight, and Project Moon, who made Lobotomy Corporation. Um, so I'm going to be talking about three major differences between indie and AAA games. This isn't like an exhaustive list, but I'm going to be talking about differences in team sizes, differences in finances, and differences in the level of creative freedom afforded to the game developers. So to begin, I'm going to be talking about team sizes. AAA games can have upwards of 100 or even 500 people working on a single project. As a result, these people tend to be very specialized. When you have 500 people, it's best to have, one person working at environments, one person working at sound design, et cetera, et cetera. And then with all of the disparate pieces that these various people have made, it falls to people like producers, like the person we saw at the last meeting, to kind of pull it all together and make a cohesive game out of it. Um, One upper example I found was Red Dead Redemption 2 apparently had 2,000 people working on it, which is unthinkable to me. So indie games, on the other hand, are often worked on by relatively small teams and frequently even individual people making their own games. So as a result, when you have, 10 people, you can't necessarily have every minute task assigned to a different person. People are encouraged to have more diverse skill sets, even if they're like less specifically good at one thing. Being okay at a lot of things can make you a massive boon in indie game development. Another upside, or not another upside, but one upside of these smaller teams from indie games is that it's much easier to coordinate. With AAA games, there's a lot of effort and energy and money spent on putting things together. Like I said, there are people whose whole jobs it is to just take everything and make a game out of it. With indie games, that's less strictly necessary. A lower amount of people means that they can all be a bit more connected, they can all easier interact with each other, and it makes the process of going back and forth to figure out what needs to be done, how does it need to be done, a lot easier. So finances. AAA games cost an exorbitant amount of money to make. In 2023, the UK Competition and Markets Authority released a report saying that AAA games that were greenlit for a potential release in 2024 and 2025 received an average development budget of $200 million. That's more money than I'll ever see in my entire life. Um, I was curious where this money went, so I looked a bit into it, and a lot of it, like a vast majority of it, is spent on paying the people making the game. Because, like I said, Red Dead Redemption 2, if you have 2,000 people working on a game, that's 2,000 people whose salaries need to be paid, and they're not working for minimum wage. Oftentimes, these people have like 80K salaries at the very minimum, and that adds up really quickly. So what little money is left after the employees are effectively paid is often spent on marketing, making sure that people know about the game, know who made it, you know, please buy our game, because that is one of the best ways to make a return on the ridiculous investment that making a AAA game is. Because when you put $200 million in a game, you sure as hell better receive some money back. Indie games are usually, unsurprisingly, have smaller finances. Um, they average about 50, somewhere in the range of 50,000 to $750,000. And that's a large range. Because there's a lot of variety in how much an indie game can cost to produce. Because, if you have a small team, like Hades, got a relatively small team, but still very competent developers not making their first game, um, that can still be really, really expensive. Meanwhile, if you're just one guy making a game in their free time, well, that doesn't cost anything. And in fact, like I note here, some, especially small indie games, don't even have budgets and are just made by solo developers as a side project. The methods in which indie games get funding also tend to differ from those of AAA games. Yes, many indie games do in fact go through publishers to, get money for their game. Devolver Digital, I know, is a very popular one for indie games, but a lot of them also rely on crowdfunding services like Kickstarter, like Hollow Knight here, which raised a budget of 37,000 United States dollars, which sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of game development making, that's really like a small amount of money. As a little aside, the budget is one of the primary reasons that the scopes of indie games tend to be a lot smaller than those of AAA games, because finances are a limiter on two very important things. They are a limiter on the number of people and a limiter on the amount of time you have to make your game. When you bring more people onto your project, they need to be paid. So if you don't have money, you don't get more people. At the same time, with your limited money, people don't get paid once and then work forever. They have to be paid, regularly. So the more people you have, the less time you have to make a game. The more money you have, the more people you can have while still having a reasonable amount of time to make a game. And the more money and time you have, the bigger your game's scope can be. What is next? So the third thing I wanted to talk about was creative freedom, because this is one of the biggest appeals of indie game development I see from a lot of people, is that compared to AAA games, you have a lot more room to kind of do what you want. And I did want to talk about that for a little bit. So AAA games, owing to their large team sizes and the, again, ridiculous amount of money required, they don't give developers much room for error. One misstep and your studio and potentially even the publisher could be completely out of money and have to shut down. So as a result, AAA games are very much encouraged by the state of the market to kind of try and stay in your lane. Obviously, you need to do something interesting to get people playing your game, but you don't want to get too ambitious or too out there or too, I guess, limiting. You want to appeal to the broadest number of people possible, because that's the only way you get a return on that money. And if you don't get a return on that money, you're screwed. So another reason that creative freedom is kind of limited in the AAA sphere, and this one is a bit more logistics based, is that when you have hundreds or even thousands of people working on a game, they can't all have equal input as to what the game is, because then these people are inevitably going to have conflicting ideas. Some of them are going to be more, I guess, out of line regarding what the primary vision for the game is than others. It's a lot of trouble to manage people with different expectations. So instead, breaking things into a strict hierarchy where you have, game designers, lead developers at the top deciding, what should the game be like? What should the gameplay loop be? What does it look like, etc. And then you have people below them that are tasked with actually making that a reality and making the game they wanted to see. And yeah, that's the only feasible way to do it when you have such a large team. And as an example, I provided Concord, not as an example of a game where creative freedom, wasn't available, I guess, but as an example of what happens when you misstep. Sony spent $200 million on this game over 8 years, and it was available for 2 weeks. Needless to say, the studio that made it doesn't exist anymore. So that's an example of just how important it is. And that's one thing I didn't talk about is the amount of time it takes. AAA video games take a lot of time to develop. So when you put all that money and all that time into a project, instead of some other project that could end up being more successful, you lose a lot. But what about indie games? So, like I've said extensively, a bunch of AAA game publishers are primarily focused on their games turning a profit because if you don't, if you're not winning, you're losing. And in AAA game development, you're losing a lot. Indie developers, on the other hand, they do still have that $300,000 to make Hollow Knight, for example. That is not a small sum of money for like a person. But a lot of the time, people are pushed to indie development, not necessarily to make a profit, but more because they're interested in seeing a game that they want to see made be made. So this gives them a little bit more freedom to experiment with unconventional mechanics, present less safe narratives, and just generally do things that make the games less broadly appealing, but instead focus in on appealing to specific niche subsections of like video gamers. Darkest Dungeon here, for example. This game is brutal. I have tried it and I have failed every time. It's not necessarily for me, but it doesn't have to be. There are people where that like teeth grinding difficulty is extremely appealing. And I haven't seen that many games that really tap into that and its sense of despair that it uses to reinforce that. So yeah, what was I? Another thing that makes more creative freedom possible is about like, appealing to fewer people is that you don't need as many sales to break even on your game when your game costs significantly less to make. Again, indie games, somewhere in the couple hundred thousands, AAA games are out here hundreds of millions and like billions. So when you do that, even with indie games generally being priced lower and like cheaper than AAA games, you need fewer sales to recoup those losses from making the game. And on a more individual level, the smaller team sizes of indie games, in the same way that it makes it easier to communicate and organize, it makes it easier for an individual to put their own little spin on things, When there's not as many people to go through and not as many people with these wildly different ideas, it's easier to find ideas from team members that fit perfectly into the game. And with fewer team members, it's likely a more tightly knit team that as a whole has a clearer vision for what the game should be like. And one last thing I want to get to is that I've been posing this as a sort of dichotomy between indie games and AAA games, but that's not quite true. Indie games and AAA games, it's not like a binary thing. They exist on a spectrum. On one end, you have games like Off or Undertale. Those are made by like one person with some help. And then from there, they get to have essentially complete creative control over what they want to do with their game. Then you have games like Hades, which is like nominally an indie game, and it is, but you can tell comparing even something like Hades and Undertale, one of these games had a much higher budget, had a larger team, and had more experienced developers working on it. Not to say, Hades is better than Undertale or whatever, but there's definitely a difference in the I guess objective quality, like, visual effects, sound design, etc. Then you have but Guilty Gear Strive here as a niche sort of game. Fighting games aren't especially like anime fighters aren't especially popular like overseas. And but Arc Systems Works, the developers, are still pretty solidly big and they do pretty well for themselves. It's not an indie game by any means. It's just on the smaller end. In a similar vein, we have Control. It's what's generally considered a double A game. So that's to say it's closer to triple A than indie, but it falls below the ridiculous prices and the extremely large teams that go into making an actual AAA game. And then, as an example of most AAA game, Overwatch by Blizzard. Like, yeah, Overwatch. They make so much money. They've gotten multiple scandals, and they continue making the game because there's so many people. You can't just take out one person, and the whole game will fall apart. Yeah, that's about it for my presentation. Please buy our merch.